and we're very excited about it. And we appreciate you coming out and supporting us tonight. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Chris Davis back here, one of our own from Humble, who's, I'm sure some of you know. He won't mind me saying, Cindy Davis's son. And you all probably know, part of the Heron family. It was Chris's idea that he brought up to us. He's a member of our museum board. And Chris had the idea, you want to do a speaker series? And we all went, yeah. You know, how do we do that? And he put the whole thing together for us with a little bit of input, and especially from Rob. So I wanted to just take some time to recognize some of the board members that are present tonight, and they are the members of the board of the Humble Museum. And we took all the bad seats over here where we can only see part of Rob when he's talking and part of the screen.
We did not.
Y'all want to stand up and say hi?
Hello, everyone.
I wanted to give special recognition because they're a hard-working bunch of ladies, and several of them have been with the museum for 40 years and over. That's a lot of years, a lot of dedication and commitment. We've placed a card in your seats that we'd like for you to fill out and leave with us tonight, just to give us an idea of what you thought about our presentation tonight and how we set up the museum. And if you have any speakers in mind that you'd like to hear, we'd like to know about that. As you can see, we also have 2 other speakers coming. I think everybody's into Elvis in East Texas right now. So if you all could do that, and then I have a sign-in clipboard that I want to pass around for everyone to sign in. If I can start with you, if you all could just, you want this pen to pass around with it too? If everyone could sign in for us. We didn't want to stop you at the door, so we decided to let everybody get seated and we'll pass that around. Men's restroom over here, ladies' restroom over here, water fountain is over here. So, in case. All right, at this time, I've kind of already introduced Chris Davis to you, Dr. Davis. He is on our board, as I said. He's also Associate Professor, I have to read this, Associate Professor of History at Lone Star College, and is the coordinator for the Center for Local and Oral History. I think he's starting the whole thing. And I'm going to let Dr. Davis take over from here, and he'll introduce our speaker. Thank y'all for coming.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'll just take a couple of minutes. I'd like to thank Lone Star College Kingwood for their support of this initiative. They've provided some new equipment, as well as the posters and advertising. And we're really excited about the partnership with the community college and the Humble Museum. It's about time we bring college back into the community and we fulfill the mission of a community college. So I'm here to do that. I'd next like to introduce our speaker for tonight. He is Dr. Robert Meaux. Dr. Robert Meaux is a local historian and past president of the Humble Museum here. He's a former college professor and currently works for Humble ISD. He spent the past 7 years researching all aspects of Humble's past, with a particular focus on its early development. His research findings have brought new insight into Humble's earliest years and its settlers. His presentation tonight is titled "The Town at Dunman's Prairie, a new look at Humble's origins and early years." Before I bring him up, could I just ask you kindly if you could put your cell phones on silent so as not to interrupt. Dr. Meaux will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for any questions. Thanks again for coming. Dr. Meaux?
All right, thank you for coming out tonight, first of our speaker series. I was very honored to be chosen as the first one for the series, and I'm very grateful you came. I have been researching the history of this town for quite some time now. Some of you have actually come to some presentations I've done over the past few years, but tonight's going to be a little bit different. So tonight I'm going to take you on a chronological journey through the town of Dunman's Prairie. I'm not going to talk about everything in Humble's history because there's a lot, but probably by the time I finish in 30 minutes, you're going to think I did. All right, the majority of knowledge we have about Humble's history has been passed down as folk stories over the years, usually from the early residents through their children and then to their children and so on. The problem with relying on this kind of knowledge is that the story changes over time. Parts get forgotten, other parts get mangled up. So for the past several years, we at the Humble Museum have been researching these folk stories. And we've basically been trying to corroborate them, take the stories and match it up to factual evidence. Birth records, death records, land records, election records, or other first-hand accounts. And our research has allowed us to correct the story of Humble's history, and even to discover parts of it people have totally forgotten about. So here's an example. In 1937, Booge Isaacs gives an interview to the Houston Chronicle. He was born in 1852 and came to the area in 1880. He's the grandfather of our curator, Nancy Coker. In this interview, Mr. Isaacs chronicles the history of Humble. Remember, this is 37. He mentions that an economic depression happened in 1893, and then he claims after the depression, things improved when Charles Bender bought the sawmill. So, if we relied on this article, we would have the sequence of events as a depression hits in 1893, it's called the Panic of 1893, and then Bender buys the sawmill. However, we know for a fact that Charles Bender bought the sawmill in 1889. We have that record of the purchase in the Harris County Archives. So this is the proper sequence of events. It's understandable that Mr. Isaacs, who was 85 years old at the time of that interview, doesn't have the facts perfectly straight about something that happened 50 years in his past. But if we'd relied solely on his information, we'd never get the story right. So folk stories are really good at getting a look at the human view of how events happen, but we have to corroborate them with actual evidence. We can't just take them as face value. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at earlier times. Let's go back to a time before US Highway 59 ran through the west side of town. That freeway was originally called State Highway 35, and it was built in 1930 and 1931. Let's go back before that. Let's go back to a time before the Humble to Moonshine Hill Road was built. That was one of the first concrete roads in Harris County. It wasn't the first, by the way, but it was one of the 4 first that were built in Harris County. It's now called First Street, or Business FM 1960, and it was built in 1917. We're going to go back before that, to a time before the Houston to Humble Road was built. That was a shell road. It was now called Old Humble Road, and it was built in 1909. But before that, all we had were dirt roads. So we're going to look at the first dirt road we know ran through this area. It was called the Atascocita Road, and it was built by the Spanish in 1756. It ran all the way from El Paso through San Antonio, Houston, Liberty, Beaumont, and terminated in Opelousas, Louisiana. Now, we know the Spanish used this road to travel across Texas, using outposts along the way to keep the French, who were in Louisiana, from trading with the local Indians. Parts of our Atascocita Road follow the path of the original Atascocito Road. All right, and by the way, for years, my mother pronounced that word as Atascocita. I would always correct her saying, stop talking like a hick, there's no U in the word, it's Atascocita. Well, when I was researching the history of this road in the archives, one of the maps spelled the name out phonetically. It's Atascocito, and I'm never going to live that one down. Always believe your mother, apparently. Okay, so the next big event that happens in Humble's history is Austin's Colony. Austin's Colony is the first legal settlement in North American families into Mexican-owned Texas. The colony began in 1821, led by impresario Stephen F. Austin. The first 2 land grants in this area were granted during the time of Austin's colony. One was to David Harris in 1824, and the other was to Victor Blanco in 1833. Now, Victor Blanco, he was the governor of Texas while it was under Mexican rule, and he was a close personal friend of Stephen F. Austin. The Victor Blanco survey is the largest single land grant in Harris County, over 22,000 acres. It consists of a large part of the southeast portion of Humble. Now, since this land was granted before the Republic of Texas came into being, Its legality was tied up for years. People challenged it, saying we shouldn't recognize it. It was given during the Mexican rule. So it's one of the last parts of Humble to be developed. A large part of the construction going on down Humble is in the Victor Blanco survey because of that. So if you're thinking of the areas around Summerwood and Fall Creek, all the stuff along Beltway 8, that's the Victor Blanco survey, and that's why it's so late to be developed. It's been fought in court for years. By the way, the 1826 census from Austin's colony lists Louisiana native Joseph Dunman and his family. At the time of Texas independence in 1836, Dunman had settled in present-day Liberty, but he and his family would eventually become one of the first settlers in this area. Okay, so by 1835, the colonists are revolting against a New Mexican government that sought to limit their freedoms. And many of those colonists participated in the Texas Revolution. On February 17, 1836, Colonel Travis sends out letters from the Alamo pleading for more men, for more supplies. Joseph Dunman is the Alamo writer who took that message to Liberty. However, the Alamo fell following month on March 6, 1836. And a few weeks later, the Texas Army defeats Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, and Texas gains its independence from Mexico. So, we have a new country. One of the early tasks of this new republic is to set up regional governments. Our county, Harrisburg County, was established on December 22nd, 1836. 3 years later, the name was changed to Harris County. Now, this is important because whenever you hear stories of Old Humble, you always hear these things, it's like the Old West. People set themselves up as sheriff or judges and stuff like that. It doesn't work that way. Harris County has rules citizens had to follow. There are rules similar to what we have today, from electing judges, from electing sheriffs, to even fees that had to be charged for different county services. So you got to be careful what you hear in those stories. Sometimes they're just not true. Now, to promote growth, the county gave away land. The goal was to have people cultivate the land, which would in turn make the land more valuable and encourage more development, thereby improving commerce for the state. Certainly would give them a taxable base. So early land grants were given to men who had fought in the Texas Revolution. Joseph Dunman received a land grant in this area in 1844. Now, by the way, 3 of the other Humble area land grants were given to relatives of Joseph Dunman. Joseph Dunman has a big family. He had like 10 kids. One of those grants went to his son-in-law, Wary B. Adams. The city of Humble is located in the Wary B. Adams survey. Another one went to his son, Joseph W. Dunman. We're going to talk about him later. And another went to another son-in-law, Jacob Ryan. So not only does Dunman have some early land here, so does a lot of the members of his family. Now, we don't know much about what happens over the next few years, but we do know in 1855, Harris County did a scholastic census. They were looking for how many children in this area were between the ages of 6 and 16. So, in the census, we found 2 settlements in this area. One of them was called the Robert Dunman Settlement, which had 16 families that had children in that age range. And the other one was the Joseph Dunman Settlement, which also had 16 families with kids in that age range. By the way, I don't know for sure how Robert Dunman and Joseph Dunman were related. We've been looking at that for years. We're not positive. Now, Joseph Dunman died a few years later in 1859, and he was buried in the Dunman family graveyard, which we now know today as the Humble Cemetery. And if you ever go to Humble Cemetery, in the far back corner of the cemetery are the Dunman graves. Okay, so let's get to Pleasant Humble. He was born in December of 1834 in Louisiana. I can't tell you how many times I've read stuff that his name was pronounced weird because he was from England. He was from Louisiana. That could explain why he talks funny. By 1850, his family, he's 17, his family is living in Tyler, Texas. Now, he eventually made his way back to Louisiana and worked as a clerk in a store owned by L.N. Markham. Now, Markham is a plantation owner. He operates a store, which Pleasant Humble works at, and he's also an active Baptist preacher. Now, Pleasant Humble and Markham's daughter, Jane Elizabeth, soon become attracted to one another. Markham didn't like this. He didn't think Pleasant Humble was good enough for his daughter. So Markham decides he's going to send his daughter to Shreveport, where she would attend a female academy. So the day before her boat sails, She and Pleasant Humble make a break for it. They elope, they get married in Caldwell County, Louisiana on October 1st, 1860, and they kept running. The outraged Reverend Markham and his 5 sons pursued them. Now, that story's been told over and over again. You can find that on the internet anywhere. And it's a romantic story. Two lovers beat odds and end up together. But some important facts get left out of that story. Number 1, Pleasant Humble was 25 at the time, and Jane Elizabeth was 17. Okay, you can see the father's a little upset. She was also 6 months pregnant when they eloped. Their son, William Smith Humble, was born 3 months later in January of 1861. Now you see why he's upset. He did eventually forgive her. Let's get our story in perspective. So a month after William Smith Humble was born, now we're in February of 1861, 7 of the 34 states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. And war broke out a couple months later in April of 1861. Pleasant Humble did serve in the Confederate Army. He first was a member of the Louisiana Infantry in 1861 and later joined Ragsdale Battalion of the Texas Cavalry in 1864. So that war ends in 65 after 4 very bloody years. By the next year, we don't know for sure when he came here, but by 1866, Pleasant Humble had moved to Texas and purchased land here in Harris County. But in 1869, he purchased 100 acres of land in this area along the San Jacinto River. Now by this time, the area had become known as Dunman's Prairie, because Joseph Dunman was the big settler here. Pleasant Humble took over operation of a ferry that had been in operation at that land he's on, and he ran a small grocery store in a house that he built near the ferry. So now we're in 1870. This is where things finally start to happen for this area. The first school in the area opens in 1873. It's a private school called Joe Dunman Schoolhouse. The school was located on the Tuscasita Road in the southern part of the district near the present-day location of River Pines Elementary. It was opened by Joseph W. Dunman. He's the son of Joseph Dunman. And students at the school were children of wealthier families in the area who could afford to pay for their children to learn reading, math, and classic literature. In 1875, a railroad was started that would go from Houston up through the forest of East Texas and on into Louisiana. The Houston East and West Texas Railway was started by a guy named Paul Bremen, who had some success with earlier railroads. By the way, his daughter married William Marshall Rice, the guy who founded Rice University. Now, it would take several years to complete this railroad, but it instantly became a boon for sawmills, since they now had an easy way to ship their lumber. So as a result of this railroad going in, sawmills began to pop up along the right-of-way of the railroad, from Houston all the way into Louisiana. Let's see, in 1876, the state gets a new state constitution. We got those a lot in those days, by the way, that drastically changed the state's education system. While it wasn't perfect, it was the beginning of the system where the state paid to educate children in the state. Before that, it was totally up to the parents. Creating an educated population, had a positive impact on the state's economic development. And as a result of this constitution, things called school communities began to appear all over Harris County. Now, a school community is basically an organization run by a 3-member board of directors, school board, and operates maybe a school or 2. The board members would hire a teacher. The school would be reimbursed by the state based on student attendance. Any child could attend a community school. It didn't matter where they lived. Well, any white child could attend a school. There were very few schools for colored children at that time. Now, for some reason, Joe Dunman's Schoolhouse, which is the only school here, was not converted into a school community, or a community school. However, we did have a school open on the west side of Dunman's Prairie. It was called the Durden School Community, and it was started in December of 1876 by 3 board members, G.L. Durden, H. Smith, and Pleasant Humble. Their only schoolhouse was called the Higgs School, and it was located near the airport on the present-day intersection of Lee Road and FM 1960. Pleasant Humble also secured a pretty good position for himself that year. This is 1876. He was elected as a Harris County Commissioner and served for the next 2 years. Now that's a powerful political position. There are 4 precincts in Harris County. There's a commissioner from each one, and those commissioners make all the decisions about Harris County, as far as where roads are going to be built, overseeing public education, and anything county money is going to be spent on. These are the guys doing it. This was the first political position he held. After after working as a commissioner, he did that for 2 years, he went on to work as an attorney. All right, by 1877, the tracks for the Houston East and West Texas Railway had finally reached Humble. They purchased a steel bridge to cross the San Jacinto River, and by April, the tracks had gotten all the way to New Caney. By the way, that same bridge is still the one they use today. Yeah, fortunately it's not a passenger train. In 1878, to generate funds while they're building the railroad, Paul Bremen ran weekend excursions from Houston to a station on the river called San Jacinto Springs. It was located where Hamlin Road crosses the tracks today, just on the other side of the river. Houstonians paid 50 cents to ride the train from Houston to San Jacinto Springs, where the railroad company provided dancing, fishing, and swimming. It's a little weekend getaway. The company even provided security personnel to ensure nobody was drinking on the trip. Now, it's the perfect time to show off the natural beauty of this area. I mean, this is where the plains meet the forest, and you've got all that river and wildlife. So more people started moving here. Okay, now, here's part of the story that's been lost over the years. We're in 1878 or so. There's a sawmill over by the Higgs School. Sorry, Higgs School's over there. Around 1876, that sawmill went bankrupt, and it got purchased by two people, Mr. Lord and Mr. Noble. Now, Irving Capers Lord had been mayor of Houston from 1875 to 1876. After he left public office, he moved up to this area, purchased that sawmill with his partner, Cornelius Noble, who was the Harris County Sheriff. The Lord and Noble sawmill was located on Townsend Road, basically where the Walmart and the new Kroger are over on 1960. Now by 1883, the area east of the railroad tracks is called Dunman's Prairie, but the area west of the railroad tracks, and I mean all the way down to like Alding Bender, was called the Lord's Mill Community. The Lord's Mill Community had farmers, livestock dealers, cattle breeders, a loading switch on the Houston East and West Texas Railroad, and a U.S. post office. That's no small feat. William Smith Humble, Pleasant Humble's son, he was the postmaster of the Lord's Mill Post Office from 1885 to 1886. And it was a growing place. It basically is what predates Humble in this area, although everything's on the west side of the tracks near the sawmill. Oh, also in 1883, Joe Dunman's schoolhouse was finally converted into a school community. It was called the Dunman School Community, and there were 15 students enrolled in that first year. But in 1884, we have a very significant event. A new state constitution, again, changed the education system. Now this one was significant because it's basically the same system we have today. It would eventually require all children to attend school, and the state increased the amount to pay for that funding, just like they do today. The state would even pay for the education of colored children if the school district wished to pursue that. Now, because of this new system, all of Harris County is divided into geographic regions, and each region was set up as a school district, just like we have today. No more school communities. If a school community had a school located in one of those geographic regions, that school then became part of the new school district. These were called Harris County Common School Districts. Each school district had a 3-member school board, but they were under the control of the Harris County Superintendent of Education. All right, the Humble area became Common School District number 28, and Joe Dunman's schoolhouse was our first schoolhouse. Now this is before we had the name Humble, so the district was called the Dunman District. The Higgs School over here ended up being in District 29, which later became Aldine ISD. All right, now we get some interesting things. Okay, so now we have a school system. We have a railroad going through the area, and we have a small community developing here. Then, things didn't go so well. In May of 1885, Irvin Lord lost some court judgment to M.C. Wellborn. To pay off his debt, he sold the sawmill through bankruptcy. So it was bought by Mr. Spencer and Mr. Wellborn, and it became known as the Spencer Sawmill. They had a new mill built. They built it closer to the tracks. Remember, this is way out by Walmart. But they defaulted on the payment for it. So in February of 1886, the sawmill closed, and with it, the Lord's Mill U.S. Post Office closed. This is February of 1886. At that point, Pleasant Humble takes over responsibility for the local mill, most likely out of his store or out of his home. In August of 1886, Pleasant Humble works with the Houston postmaster and completed an application to set up a new U.S. post office. On the application, he lists the name of the town as Humble, Texas. That's the first time we ever see that in writing. So basically, he hijacks the name of the area. It was no longer Dunman's Prairie, it now is Humble. And of course, you don't say the H because that's the way you pronounce his name. The application was granted and Pleasant Humble was appointed, not selected himself, he was appointed by the U.S. postmaster as the town's first postmaster in September of 1886. By the way, the next year in 1887, he was elected as the Justice of the Peace for Precinct 4. So he's a Harris County judge while he's the postmaster. Now, the stories you may have heard about Pleasant Humble was a wandering fisherman that moved to the area and set himself up as postmaster and judge. That's just totally incorrect. Pleasant Humble is not some wandering postman. He is a very experienced politician. He's now had 3 political appointments in this area. All right, in 1888, as more people moved into this young town, we get a new problem. Joe Dunman's schoolhouse is way out there. Now remember, this is for cars, so you're walking places or you're riding a horse. It's more in the southern part of the district. So as more people moved here, they wanted a school closer to them. And they wanted more control over it. So they asked the Harris County Commissioners to create a new district for them. The request was granted, and what they did is they took District 28 and they split it in 2. The northern part remained as District 28, Humble, and the southern part became District number 35, a new district called Dunman's. Joe Dunman's schoolhouse is down in the southern part of the district, so it's District 35, and it was renamed as the Dunman's Prairie School. Now for District 28 up in the north, William Humble donates an acre of land, and a new school had to be built called the West River School because their only school is now down in the other district. The school was located on the corner of Isaacs Road and Old Humble Road, on land that is now part of the Humble Cemetery. District 28 also had a school for colored students. It was called the Narrow Gauge School, most likely because it was located in an old train car. We don't have any pictures of it. All right, so in 1889, the remains of the Spencer sawmill, remember they had a new mill built, they couldn't afford it, went bankrupt, was sold to George Milledge and T.T. Calhoun. 2 months later, they had to sell it through bankruptcy. You're seeing how this goes? So, Charles Bender purchases this sawmill, him and his partner J.C. Matthews. The sale included the mill, the land, all of this land in the Werribee Adams survey, engines, boilers, and a tram and tramways to build throughout the forest. Humble's growth is directly tied to the success of Charles Bender and that sawmill. So, who was Charles Bender? Okay, Charles Bender is a native of Germany, where he apprenticed to be a banker. He came to America at the age of 15 and worked as a banker in New York. He then went into baking, not banking, baking. He eventually opened up a bakery in Missouri, but he lost everything in the Civil War. After the Civil War, he became a cattleman, and he opened a beef packaging plant in New Brunswick. But devastating flood comes through. He loses $18,000 worth of property and over 3,000 head of cattle. After that, he purchased a sawmill in Spring. And it's a very successful sawmill. So successful, he was able to purchase a second sawmill, the one here in Humble. It was the success of Bender's sawmill that helped the town grow throughout the 1890s. And thanks to the Houston East and West Texas Railway, the Bender sawmill shipped lumber all over the world. Charles Bender was a successful businessman and he was a generous benefactor. He built housing for his employees and over the years allowed them to purchase the houses from the company for little or no money at all. All right, so that brings us to the next major phase of Humble's history, oil. You don't have it listed here. You're right. Don't press the next one. Okay, so the Texas oil boom begins in 1901. Patillo Higgins, a Beaumont native, was convinced that oil existed under a hill in Beaumont called Sour Hill Mound. He teams up with a guy named Captain Anthony Lucas, who is an experienced engineer and the leading expert in the U.S. on salt dome formations. Lucas and Higgins made plans to drill on Sour Hill Mound, which is now known as Spindletop Hill. On January 10th, 1901, the Lucas well at Spindletop successfully struck a reserve of oil. And unlike other oil discoveries in which the oil had to be scooped out of the ground, The Lucas well was under such high pressure because of the salt dome that the oil shot out of the top of derrick to a height of more than 150 feet. This is a new term for the oil industry called gusher. They didn't have it before then. It was the most productive oil reserve ever found up to that time. Now, in the Gulf Coast region, oil fields are usually associated with small hills. It's evidence of a salt dome. Those hills are rarely more than 2 miles in diameter, and in Humble, such a hill exists near the West Fork of the San Jacinto River, which is the one up here where the bridge is. It's an elevation rising barely more than 20 feet out of the ground, and it was known as the Eccles Ridge. All right, we're back on track. Good. Throughout 1902 and 1903, 2 people were drilling for oil in the Eccles Ridge area. George Hart and Charles Barrett repeatedly sunk wells, and each time their rigs were destroyed by high-pressure gas explosions. They were hitting gas pockets instead of oil. Now, by 1904, there were many experienced oil men drilling for oil in Humble. Several of them were from oil companies that had formed in Beaumont because of Spindletop. So that same year, by the way, in 1904, Charles Bender lays out the official street map for Humble, which we now call downtown Humble. He named the streets running east and west through the town after famous oilmen who were drilling for oil in Humble at that time. Thus we have Granbury Street, named after Prentice Granbury, Stadeye Street, named after Henry Stadeye, Barrett Street, named for Charles Barrett, although it's now called Main Street. And I don't have a picture of Charles Barrett. And Higgins Street, named for Patillo Higgins of Beaumont. All right, so Ross Sterling is the next guy who comes into our story. He had opened a feed store in many of the other oil boom towns and developed a reputation as a really trusted shopkeeper. Many of the oil guys wouldn't buy from anybody but Ross Sterling. So, of course, he opens one in Humble. It opens it right by the tracks in 1904 and starts doing pretty well. In 1904 also, we had the first official oil strike in Humble. It happened on November 7th, 1904. The well was operated by the Moonshine Company, which is owned by Walter Sharp, James Sharp, Ed Prater, and Howard Hughes Sr. That well produced about 100 barrels of oil a day. It was all over the papers that day. Now, immediately after the Moonshine strike, land that had been selling for as little as $10 an acre is now selling for over $20,000 an acre. The first gusher in the Humble oil field was something called the Beatty No. 2 well, and it was completed on January 7th of 1905. It yielded 8,500 barrels of oil a day. Now, the discovery of oil in Humble brought a flood of people into this area. Everyone was looking to make their fortune in the oil field. So this sleepy little lumber town of about 100 people became like 10,000 people in a matter of a few weeks. And there's not a lot of housing for them, so most of them are living in tents on or around the oil leases. All right, we're in 1906. So sadly in 1906, Mrs. Jane Elizabeth Humble dies, and their son William dies also about that same time. Charles Bender also died in February of that year, and his sons took over operation of the lumber business. Pleasant Humble, who by now has become feeble, went to live with his sister in Hardin County, where he later died in either 1910 or 1912. We don't know because there's no death certificate, and we can't find the body. So we have to assume that's when he died. All right, by 1907, the Eccles Ridge, that's where all the oil strikes were, had become known as Moonshine Hill at that point, most likely in honor of the Moonshine Company that did the first strike. I've heard people say it was because of moonshine. No. It's Eccles Ridge up until about 1907. All right, so thanks to the oil business, more and more money is pouring into this area in the form of taxes. Think of that land and how much it's worth. So this helped District Number 28 build the town's first brick schoolhouse in 1909. It was called the Humble School, and it was built on Higgins Street. And it was located where Charles Bender High School stands today. It burned in a fire in 1929. Now at the same time, a new colored school was built across the tracks near Bordersville. It was a wooden one, not a brick one, and it was never even given a name. It's simply called the Colored School. And sadly, no pictures of it exist, even though it stood there for 40 years. By the way, here's something interesting. Okay, so the county commissioner at this time for Precinct 4 lives in Humble. His name is James William Hall, and he was elected to that position in about 1908. Now, if you remember, Pleasant Humble once served in that position. That was his first position. All right, so in addition to being county commissioner, J.W. Hall is also on the Humble School Board. At that time, the west boundary of the district was the railroad tracks. So all of Humble was on this side of the railroad tracks. But the Humble School District wanted to build a color school on the other side of the tracks, near Bordersville. Unfortunately, the Harris County Commissioners voted to extend Humble's property line that way. Wasn't that convenient? Now, Alding didn't like that because it took land away from Alding and gave it to Humble, who didn't think it was fair at all, especially considering one of the commissioners is on our school board. And they protested that for years, at that little red area there. And by the way, the district boundary still sits there today. It's basically over to where McKay Drive is. And we have J.W. Hall to thank for that. Okay, now I'm not going to go a lot further, but there are some things I want to highlight that happens over the next few years. So at this point, the town is established. There are homes, there are businesses, everything's running. But it's still just a town. There's no local government. The local judge, who is Nick Lambert by this time, and the local constable, William Humble, they've been running everything for years. Well, of course, until William Humble dies in 1906. So in 1910, the town has an election on whether or not to incorporate the town. The election was 92 people for it and 72 people against it. But there were some accusations that Judge Lambert prevented some citizens from voting, who presumably would have voted against incorporation. So that case worked its way through the Texas Supreme Court for a few months, who eventually voted in favor of Judge Lambert, and Humble became a city. Inexplicably, at least I haven't figured out why yet, 1 year later they hold another election on abolishing the incorporation. It passes. 28 citizens voted to abolish the incorporation and 18 voted against it. So Humble became a town again. Still don't figure that one out. I figured maybe they didn't like the taxes. In 1911, Ross Sterling, who by this time had become a banker, he owned a few oil wells. He wasn't really competing against the other oil companies, he just owned a few oil wells. He joined with some other small-time oil well owners and formed the Humble Oil Company, and he served as president. Now, he sold his shares in 1925, and he went into other businesses. At one point, he owned the Houston Post. But he also served as governor of Texas from 1931 to 1933. Now, even without Sterling, Humble Oil continued to do pretty well. It became a world-class oil company, later merged with Standard Oil of New Jersey, and became Exxon in '72. That's one of my favorites. 1912, there was a fire in downtown Humble, right here. When I took my first tour of the Humble Museum 7, 8 years ago, this is the story they told me. They said 2 brothers were playing poker. One of the brothers gets mad at the other one, throws a lantern at him, starts the Humble fire in 1912. It's a great story. It's not true. So the Houston Chronicle wrote extensively about the fire those few days. It was big news. I mean, 2.5 blocks of the town go up in smoke. The Houston Fire Department came here, and it took them hours to put it out. Even the town's only brick building, the Humble State Bank building, was destroyed in the fire. Commissioner J.W. Hall, his store was also destroyed in the fire. It was across the street. There's no mention of any brothers playing poker. I don't know where that story came from. It's nowhere in the Houston Chronicle all those years. Let's see. Oh, 1912. We're in 1912. They were also drilling for oil in 1912, and they tapped, instead of oil, into an artesian well. That's the Humble landmark over on 1st Street. Many people have written or think that that's where the Humble Waterworks is located. That's absolutely false. The Humble Waterworks, which opened in 1905, 7 years before they drilled that artesian well, it was around until 1933 when the city of Humble came into being. They took over possession of it. So from 1905 to 1933, Nick Lambert's Waterworks, you can see pictures here if you want to see it, was located at the corner of Main Street and Old Humble Road. It's exactly where the Humble swimming pool stands today. And we have maps showing it clearly. All right, lastly, the town of Humble. So that place that starts out as a settlement on Dunman's Prairie is finally incorporated, this time permanently, in 1933. It's continued to grow, it's continued to be a place of business, and it's got great recreation, and it's a pretty good place to live. Any questions? We do have time for questions if you have any. My mind is not encyclopedic. I found that during an interview on Monday. But I can answer any questions you have best I can. Yes?
Subject, but how was it that Iman's father suspected that there was oil at the Bernier plantation?
No idea. Sorry.
We couldn't hear.
Where was the hog plantation at?
That was the west. Bernier Malt fermentation.
You know, they weren't really for oil over there. I mean, that became a,
Yeah, they said that when Mr. Holland began talking to, had a way to tell that.
okay, well, I don't know that, but here's how they could tell in Humboldt. And they'd
Can you
actually
repeat the question?
She was asking how I'm a Hog's father knew there was oil under the land they owned out in West Houston. In Humboldt, back as early as 1876, a guy named James Slaughter had noticed some peculiar things about the water. It had gas in it. He would sink, if he was trying to get people to drill for oil in this area for years, he would sink a pipe into his backyard and light it.
That's what they did.
Okay, and so I mean, there was evidence that there was something here. In fact, I'm reading in the Houston Chronicle where he's actually put out ads trying to get people to come here and drill. They would come here and see his demonstrations in his backyard. And again, eventually, in 1902, once oil hit in Spindletop, people finally came out here and started drilling. But they had signs of it, and they said the water even tasted weird because it was just loaded with gas.
Also, that's what it was, yeah.
Probably was.
Yes.
What else? Nothing?
We have a story in the school, right? Obviously, it was named after a story.
Right.
Do you know why?
You know, that's a really good question because right now,
Can you repeat it?
Humboldt,
Can you repeat the question?
Ross Sterling Middle School in Humboldt. Why was it named that way? You know, and it's really funny. All right, so Humboldt ISD is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary. I've got 3 committees. Dr. Moore's on one of them, working in the district on this history. There are only 2 schools in Humboldt named after people. I mean, there's Humboldt High School and Elementary. Those aren't really named after Pleasant Humboldt. They're named after the town. Jack Fields Elementary, which I've been reading the board minutes about why that one is. I mean, Lynn Fields was on the board at the time. They purchased the land from Jack Fields. I have not seen any logical reason of why they suddenly named the other middle school Ross Sterling. And that was I was a Title I coordinator. That was one of my schools. So I really have no idea. And it's not explained in the board minutes, whereas the Jack Fields ones goes on for some time. Humboldt doesn't like naming schools after people. You know, we were curious of the one they just built, Elementary 28, which they just named the Groves Elementary. We were really wondering if they were going to name that for somebody, but they don't like naming them after people. And I get it, because Houston ISD has named schools after people, and they've had to change the names of the schools when those people fall out of favor. Aldine ISD, I grew up in Aldine, they also tend to name schools after people, but sometimes there's issues with that. If you name them after a neighborhood, the name of that neighborhood rarely changes.
Or was it just named after the governor? He was a governor, Sterling.
Yeah, but I mean, what is it at the time? Ross Sterling opened about, I just want to say, 9-10 years ago, maybe. So yeah, I mean, but it's weird that they named it after the governor, even though it's from the area, when they haven't named any other school like that. It's kind of odd. You weren't on the school, were you?
No, I was there when we named Jack Fields.
Jack Fields.
I know that story well, but that Ross Sterling occurred after I retired from the board in 2002.
By the way, Dr. Moore holds the record of serving on the board longer than anybody else. He served on the Humboldt School Board for 27 years. 27 and a half. You always correct me when I say that.
I say 28 because it was 27 in like 6 or 7 months.
Right.
And in 2004, they appointed me for 5 more months when someone had to leave the board in the middle of the term.
And you're right, it is 28 years. Yes, sir.
Was the Humboldt Oil offices located in Ross Sterling's store?
No.
No?
Pretty much right after they formed, they moved to Houston. And that's the real sad part about Humboldt, that all this oil that was here, none of the Humboldt people made a fortune off of it. I went to the University of Houston, so there's names I associate with the University of Houston. Blafford, Hoffines, all those people and Herman made their fortunes here. And then they took it back to Houston. Humboldt didn't benefit much except for, they got some increased tax money and built some better schools. Yes?
What is the Hicks name?
Oh, the Higgs School. Anybody know that one? Who is the Higgs School is named after?
It was a Hicks family.
But I don't know the family, do you?
I can't recall the first name, but it was a Hicks family that lived out there. One of them was a teacher that worked there.
Okay.
I have a question.
Hey, what's it?
When I was, you got somebody else?
Yeah, I'm sorry, playing one second. Yeah, go ahead.
This area was ever convicted to flooding?
Oh, I'm sure. In fact, there's stories that Pleasant Humble's original home flooded, and he moved away from the San Jacinto River at that point. It's taken me years to actually figure out where all the places he lived. I know he lived over by the river and near the ferry, and we now know where the ferry was located. But if you go down FM 1960 bypass, it kind of does an S curve and there's a Shell station there. That plot of land, right where the S curve is, was where he lived.
Lake Houston.
No, that was just a river then. Yes, sir.
When I was active with this museum, we were told, and it was kind of considered common knowledge, and this may be wrong, I don't know, that for many years, a oil company would bring their mail out here so the postmark,
Oh, I didn't know that.
Every Christmas, at Christmas, they had it postmarked out here. There'd be sacks and sacks of mail waiting to be processed. And they brought it, that's what all I knew about this Christmas, but I saw that myself.
How did West Production?
Yes, I did.
The which production?
West Production.
I don't know that one. Is it one of the oil companies? There were a lot of oil companies.
It was Jim West
Okay.
out of Houston, and his family came from Trinity into Houston. The dad was in sawmills and
I don't know him.
oil and gas.
When I've been doing research on Moonshine Hill, and I'm still doing this, there are a lot of oil, and it's amazing because some of the people I've talked about had a stake in some of these oil companies that you wouldn't expect.
Your dad worked with West.
Ron,
Yes.
can you talk more about where the original ferry was and?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to show that without a map. The land that Joseph Dunman owned, he actually, a lot of times when these guys would get land through those land grants, they didn't actually live here. So there's James Strange survey, which is a huge survey. He never lived here. Immediately sold the land or rented it out to people, so ownership keeps changing. The ferry, River Road Bridge, which is Old Humble Road. I love Old Humble Road because it's got like 4 or 5 names. It's like Old Humble Road, then it's East Main or South Main, and then River Road. Old Humble Road, where it hits the river, there used to be a bridge there a few years before they built the highway over here. For years, I really thought the ferry was located in that area, and then I'm doing some research last month. I'm going through a lot of the Dunman family stuff and found land records that actually, it's on Joseph Dunman lands where it has the ferry marked. So we actually know where the ferry is. It's a little further east of where the bridge used to be. It's a little further east of River Road. That land was acting, it's funny because one of the stories I originally heard was that Pleasant Humble started the ferry. And as you go back to the Harris County Archives, that ferry had been here for decades before Pleasant Humble ever showed up because Harris County had rules on how much the ferry passengers had to pay, even as back as 1840. So we know that he basically, when he bought the land, he took it over from the previous tenants, and who, by the way, was a Dunman descendant. Yes.
Robert, I would like to say that the J.W. Hall that you mentioned frequently tonight, he has a house that's still standing on Stali and Avenue A.
What's interesting is the early yearbooks, because Humble High School, the first Humble High School opened in 1918, 1919, and it was located on the property next door to Charles Bender High School. There used to be 2 schools there. And those yearbooks, they not only tell you who the school board members are, they have pictures of all their homes. And I remember J.W. Hall's home is in one of those pictures. He was an interesting person because, like I said, he was our school board member, he was our county commissioner, and then he became a state representative, and then a state senator, and then he became the Harris County tax assessor and collector before he died. He was a true politician. And he lived, when I'm reading about him, he lived in New York. Not when it was a neighborhood of Houston, when it was his own little separate community far from Houston. And now, of course, it's been absorbed by Houston, as everything else has been. Yes, ma'am. Carlos.
Hi, Dr. Moore. What do you think in your research and your information and background and everything, what do you think could have kept the oil money in Humboldt instead of going to Houston?
I'm not sure any of it could. Because basically, as soon as oil was discovered here, think of Spindletop. Spindletop starts oil like we've never seen it before, and then oil becomes in demand. So all these oil companies that we know today, the Texas company, which is Texaco and all, they all formed in Spindletop. As soon as oil was struck here, they all came here. So you have these rich oil companies immediately moving in, buying land, and getting oil, and starting to build pipelines to ship it somewhere else to be processed. I don't think anything ever would have kept the oil here. Had it been the first one like Spindletop, sure. But at this point, and like again, sad to say, our people didn't make money from the oil. Yes, sir.
I came here in '70, And by about 75, I was looking for a few acres of land to put a pony on for the kids, and you know, y'all know the story. And we were looking at some land on Old River Road.
Okay.
About halfway between Humble and the river. And there was, I think, 25 acres for sale that I looked at. And it really was a good bargain price. When we got to look at it, it was divided into 20 by 40 foot lots. And we could get a deed on about 70% of it. The rest of it, you know, they couldn't find the deeds even, you know, 60 years later from when it was deeded.
Now, that's a good point. Let me tell you what's the story on that. So when the oil is discovered, they start subdividing acre lots into what they call them carpet lots, 10 by 20, just enough room to build a derrick. And so for a while we had derricks that are just so close together you can just walk from one to the other, no problem. That actually became a big problem for Humble because you had all these little plots of land that could be owned by 20 or 30 people, that little plot of land. Humble almost didn't make it through the 1950s. There's no room to build. Nobody can buy land to build houses. Nobody can buy land to build businesses. The Humble School District actually almost got merged with another school district to the south at that time, which is called North Forest, which got absorbed by the state in Houston ISD a couple years ago. It was only for some reason when the airport really started coming in that those, I guess they either found the people who owned the land or basically considered them abandoned, that the land finally started being developed. But it wasn't until the 70s that starts happening. Humble is landlocked. They can't buy the land. You can't even find all the people who own the land to buy it. And that's why Humble almost died in the 1950s. Really, it was the airport, and suddenly now that land becomes viable because people want to live near the airport, that it finally was starting to be sold.
I wouldn't go buy.
I don't blame you. Yes, sir.
I have a question on President Humble. I've seen several references in my research where it talks about the fact that he may have owned a business or two in the area directly across from 5th Ward, downtown Houston, between the area of 610 and I-10. I think I even saw a census record that may have even mentioned him living in a house at that point in time. Have you?
It could be on the census record. When I went through the land records, like at the time in 1869, he owned the 100 acres up here. It wasn't the only land he owned. He owned land throughout the city of Houston. And in the 1880s, he's actually listed in the Houston directories as a grocery dealer or a wood dealer. So he was doing a lot of stuff at one time. Yeah, and I can see very easily that he owned land out in that area. Those land records, I think, I was going through those records at the Clayton Library, and it's just a ton of them. He owned quite a bit of land, and I know he probably made some good money off that. Now, what happened to it eventually, you know, hotel.
So the oil boom was from what year to?
Well, that's a little tricky because the oil boom hits in 1904. I mean, that's when oil starts, but it doesn't become a boom until that big well happens in 1905. It doesn't last long at all because what happens is, you know, they're drilling for oil. They're not doing a very good job of it. Pretty soon, water from the river starts filling up the oil wells. So I don't think the original oil boom lasted but a year or so. Now, people are still able to get some oil out of the grounds, but not the big gushers they were getting before that. Now, we get two other oil booms later on. I remember one's like 1917 or 18 or so, and there's one in the 30s. So as we get more deep drilling techniques. Now, we still have people digging for oil out here now. They come in the museum frequently, and they're bringing their potential investors to show off the town. But they're still finding oil here. It's just how deep you can dig. But the early ones, they destroyed it by not drilling well, and water started seeping into the wells. Yes, ma'am.
When you said in 1950, Humble School District almost became part of North Shore.
Mm-hmm. It was a school district called the East and Mount Houston School District.
Yes, I'm real familiar with it, and we as board members are familiar with it.
There was a vote on it.
Aware of all.
Oh yeah, there's a vote on it. We have the flyers from the vote in the election itself, and we had the school board minutes that talk about it. The school board at the time was not in favor of it.
What?
The school board was not in favor of the merger. And I can understand the area over there is kind of poor. They have more students, and Humble is running out of students. That was probably going to be the solution to merge them. But the vote didn't pass. And so East and Mount Houston School District continued to have problems over the years, and they did all the way up to the time TEA took them over a couple years ago. But fortunately for us, Once land started being sold again, we got more students. So we didn't falter away like that district did.
Well, we had those students for several years.
They actually, we would let them, for those students, we'd let them come and go to school here. Their district paid us to let, especially the high school students come here, because we were the closest high school. But yeah, we have, I think in the book, we have one of the election things printed as a picture in the book.
Really?
Yes, the next question, yes ma'am.
Yeah, so when they had a transition from their oil, and they were trying to sell like land or houses and
Mhm.
things like that, how is the legislation in terms of rights for doing oil? Like, how do they change, if anything?
Well, at that time, there's no legislation that your land, you can drill all you want. Those people are selling to the oil companies. Sorry, those people are selling to the oil companies. Now, here's why we know so much about what's going on in Humboldt at that time. Those oil companies being sued left and right every single year from people who feel like the oil company didn't really treat them well. They didn't pay enough for their land, or they drilled on parts of the land they didn't know. Thanks to Google Books, you can now go online and read all of those court cases. So you're reading them all or the oil companies are suing each other. There's several where several oil companies are suing the Herman estate or Herman himself because there's conflicting rules about who owns this land. I say this is my land, you said it's yours, and it has to be settled in the courts. That's why we know so much about that period of almost time, lawsuits. Is that it? Yes, ma'am. One more. It's an environmentalist nightmare, and we put a lot of pictures of this in the book. If you look through the books, when they first started getting oil, it's just swelling on the ground. They eventually built earth tanks to hold, but it's just dirt. So they're losing a lot of oil through the tanks. It was years before they finally decided to build a tank structure out of wood. And of course, those caught fire. They started building them out of steel. But it's an environmentalist nightmare. I cannot imagine what condition the ground at Moonshine Hill is really in. Because if you go out there and look now, there's a lot of areas where there's water from the river. Well, if you look at the old aerial photographs from those years, there's no water there.
Where's that?
Moonshine Hill, it's up the road. If you go up 1960, there's a big power station. And right next, kind of just down from that, is a kids thing called Old McDonald's Farm. Where that power station is, that's the heart of Moonshine Hill. And there's a historical marker right next to it. And there's not a lot of stuff left at Moonshine Hill. I've taken tours. I took the Humboldt Geological Society tour there one day. It's a trashed area right now. Yeah, there's not a lot of stuff there anymore. There's no more there, so those are all taken down. Yep. Yes, sir.
At one point, we were looking at that area.
Right.
And realtors told us that will never develop because that land is still so polluted.
Yeah, I can believe it. It's a mess. That oil's just running on the ground. Anything else? We're out of time? Yes, sir.
You mentioned Howard Hughes
Senior, yes.
who came from Iowa, and came down. He was really an attorney. If you go into his history, and he sees the opportunity to patent the drill bit that has been developed. But during your research, have you seen anything that indicated that Howard Hughes Jr. was born here?
No, everything for one, we don't have a birth certificate for Howard Hughes. I think the one he eventually had was a delayed birth certificate, which is written later. There's none in the Harris County archives, and we've looked. We've stood in a line for hours to find them. The word is he was born in Harris County, which is probably true. His parents were living here at the time. But the word is that he was born in Humboldt. There's just no proof to support that.
Yeah, you can Google it up, and it'll show Humboldt, Texas.
Right.
Born. And the fact that Howard Hughes Jr. did not have a birth certificate, he applied for one when he was like 20 years old.
That's a delayed birth certificate, right?
Because he wanted to get a pilot's license.
Right.
And it shows Houston, Texas, but there's a lot of articles, magazine articles that says Humboldt, Texas.
And it's probably just word of mouth. I mean, there's some stuff I found that if you go look up stuff for President Humboldt, it's just stories people have. But again, the problem is there's no proof there's nothing to prove it, is the problem. So it could be true, it could not be true.
And he said he buried in Houston?
Oh, yeah, he's buried at the, I can't remember the really nice, Glenwood, the really nice cemetery. And his grave is gated off, you can't get anywhere near it. I'm a ghoul, I go through cemeteries. Ross Sterling's also buried there, by the way.
Okay, thank you. Can we have another round of applause? In closing, I would like to plug Rob's books. We've got 2 here. They're on sale here at the museum. I'm sure he'd be happy to sign them for you.
Absolutely.
Please, if you didn't get a chance to sign in, please do so. We'll leave it up here if you'd like to know who's here. And the comment cards. You can just leave them in your seat. We welcome any feedback. And we would just like to also mention our next event will be Thursday, May 18th. Again, same hour, same place. This will be a discussion of Bordersville. Emily Humble, who is a...
Humble. Pronounce the H.
Yes. Is a student at Kingwood Park High School and did a research paper, an oral history project, I believe which Dr. Moe helped.
Yeah, she did a phenomenal job.
Right? We've invited A.W. Jones, who's agreed to come. So we think that'll be a really good evening. Please spread the word if you enjoyed your time here. We want to have regular seasons. This is our first one. First speaking event, first season. We'll have another one in May, another one in June, and then we'll kick off our fall season in September when we line up some additional speakers. I think that's about it. Yeah. Thank you again for coming, and we think tonight was a real success.
Where's your wife?
He didn't come tonight, no. She's had a busy couple of days.
I don't know.